A beggar paid for the desperate elderly woman's gasoline. The next day he was surrounded by men in suits. The cold July wind cut through the streets of downtown Chicago as Richard Thompson adjusted the small blanket over his daughter Sophia, who slept curled up on the park bench. At 42, his face, marked by exhaustion, still held traces of dignity, remnants of a previous life that seemed increasingly distant. Just 6 months ago, he was the owner of a thriving import business. Now everything he owned fit into 2 worn-out backpacks. Sophia, with her 9 years and curious eyes that seemed bigger than the world, was his only reason to keep fighting. The day dawned with the promise of more challenges. Richard gently woke Sophia, trying to maintain the ritual they had created since they found themselves on the streets. A smile, a hug, and the silent promise that this situation was temporary. The girl responded with her usual resilience, packing her few belongings with an organization that moved her father. "Dad, today is going to be a special day," Sophia said, with that inexplicable certainty of children. Richard nodded, wanting to believe his daughter's words as much as she did. They walked to a nearby gas station, where the owner, Mr. Joseph, sometimes allowed them to use the bathroom and have a coffee in exchange for small tasks. It was one of the few kindnesses they still found in their new world. Then the unexpected happened. An elegant lady, with silver hair and an aristocratic posture, parked her imported car near the fuel pump. Richard watched as she frantically searched her purse, her wrinkled face twisted in worry. "I'm sure it was here. Oh my God, I must have left it at the restaurant," the lady murmured, visibly distressed. Sophia tugged at her father's sleeve. "She needs help, Dad." Richard hesitated for only a moment. In his pocket, he had $47 to $80, all the money he had managed to earn over the past 2 days doing odd jobs. It was enough to buy food for him and Sophia for a few days, if they budgeted carefully. "Mom?" Richard approached, keeping a respectful distance. "Can I help?" The woman looked at him, initially with suspicion, but something in his sincere expression made her relax. "Oh dear, I left my wallet at the restaurant where I had lunch. How embarrassing, now I'm out of gas and out of money." "How much do you need to fill the tank?" asked Richard. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly accept," she began. But Richard had already walked over to the attendant. "Please put $40 worth of gas in the lady's car," he said, handing over practically all his money. Sophia watched the scene with a proud smile, while the lady, who introduced herself as Mrs. Helen Anderson, looked at father and daughter with growing interest and emotion. "You are angels," said Mrs. Helen, her eyes welling up. "How can I repay you?" "You don't have to, ma'am," replied Richard. "Sometimes we just need to trust one another." Mrs. Helen observed more closely the worn-out clothes of both, the tattered backpack, the tired look in Richard's eyes, and the hopeful gaze of Sophia. A sudden understanding crossed her face. "Do you have a place to stay?" she asked gently. Richard looked down, feeling the weight of the shame he carried. Sophia held his hand, conveying strength. "At the moment, we're in a difficult situation," he replied, maintaining his dignity. Mrs. Helen reached into her purse and pulled out a card. "I live in a house that's too big for a lady alone. I have a guest room that's never used. It would be an honor if you could join me for coffee." Richard hesitated, but Sophia squeezed his hand tighter. The simple act of kindness he had offered was returning in a way he could never have imagined. "Are you sure, Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "My grandson Michael always says we should follow our intuition," replied Mrs. Helen with a warm smile. "And my intuition tells me you are special people." At that moment, as the winter sun finally broke through the clouds, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Sophia smiled, as if she had known all along that this would truly be a special day. "Shall we have that coffee then?" invited Mrs. Helen, opening her car door. Richard looked at Sophia, who was already confidently heading toward the vehicle. Sometimes, he thought, it only takes a small act of kindness to change the course of an entire life. Mrs. Helen's house was a mansion in the Beverly Hills neighborhood, with a meticulously maintained garden and an air of understated elegance. As they passed through the main gate, Sophia couldn't contain her admiration, her eyes scanning every detail of the place. Mary, the housekeeper who had worked with Mrs. Helen for 2 decades, greeted them with a warm smile, though her eyes showed restrained curiosity. Within minutes, the dining table was set with coffee, hot chocolate, fresh bread, and a variety of fruits that made Sophia's eyes sparkle. "Please, help yourselves," said Mrs. Helen, watching with satisfaction as Sophia carefully picked up a red apple with reverent care. "Mary, could you prepare the guest room on the second floor?" Richard sipped his coffee, savoring the rich and familiar flavor he hadn't tasted in so long. His hands trembled slightly, and he tried to process the sudden change in his circumstances. "Mrs. Helen, your generosity is immense, but I can't accept," he began, but was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. "Grandma, are you home?" A male voice echoed down the hallway. "In the dining room, Michael," replied Mrs. Helen, her eyes lighting up at the mention of her grandson. Michael entered the dining room still wearing his white lab coat, carrying a briefcase and a stethoscope hanging around his neck. He was a man in his 30s, with kind eyes and a welcoming smile that immediately put Richard at ease. "Oh, we have guests," he said, seeming genuinely pleased by the presence of strangers in the house. Mrs. Helen quickly introduced Richard and Sophia, recounting their meeting at the gas station. Michael listened attentively, his face showing a mix of admiration and compassion. "You know, Grandma," said Michael, sitting at the table, "I always say your instincts are spot on." Sophia, who had been quiet until then, was fascinated by Michael's stethoscope. Noticing her interest, he took it off his neck. "Want to try it?" he offered. The girl's eyes lit up. "Can I really?" Michael helped Sophia put on the stethoscope, teaching her how to listen to her own heart. Her face lit up with discovery and wonder. "This is amazing," she exclaimed. "Dad, I can hear my heart beating." Richard watched the scene with contained emotion. Seeing his daughter smile like that, after months of hardship and uncertainty, was an indescribable gift. "Sophia," Michael began, "did you know we have a little lab here at home? My grandma always supported my interest in science, so we set up a space in the attic with a microscope and other interesting things." "Really?" Sophia's excitement was palpable. "If your dad allows it, I can show you some experiments later," Michael offered, looking at Richard for approval. Richard nodded, grateful for the kindness they had found in that house. Mrs. Helen watched everything with a serene smile, as if that scene was exactly what her home needed. "Richard," she said, "I know you must feel uncomfortable accepting our help, but sometimes life presents us with opportunities disguised as chance. Michael and I have plenty of space and resources, and your presence here would be a blessing for this house, which has been too quiet lately." Michael agreed. "Besides, Sophia clearly has a natural interest in science. It would be a pleasure to be her mentor." Richard felt tears forming in his eyes but held them back. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Mrs. Helen interrupted gently. "Just accept it. Sometimes helping others is the best way to help ourselves." At that moment, Mary returned to the kitchen. "The room is ready, Mrs. Helen." "Great," the lady smiled. "Michael, why don't you take Sophia to see your lab while I show Richard the room?" As they went upstairs, Richard watched his daughter follow Michael, bombarding him with questions about science. The doctor responded to each question with genuine patience and enthusiasm. The room was spacious, with 2 comfortable beds, an old solid wood wardrobe, and a view of the garden. Richard placed his worn-out backpack beside the bed, feeling the contrast between his shabby belongings and the elegance of the surroundings. "Richard," Mrs. Helen said softly, "I know you must be wondering why I trusted you all so quickly. So let's just say I've learned over the years to recognize kindness in people. Your gesture at the gas station showed me everything I needed to know about your character." The following weeks brought a comforting routine for Richard and Sophia. The guest room truly became their home, with Sophia's drawings decorating the walls and some new belongings that Mrs. Helen had insisted on buying, despite Richard's initial protests. Michael kept his promise, dedicating his free afternoons to teaching science to Sophia. The attic, transformed into a laboratory, became the girl's favorite place, where she learned about cells, basic chemistry, and astronomy with contagious enthusiasm. Richard often found them hunched over the microscope or conducting simple experiments, with Sophia meticulously taking notes in a notebook she had received from the doctor. On a particularly pleasant afternoon, while Sophia was engrossed in her research with Michael, Richard helped Mary organize the pantry. The housekeeper, who had initially been reserved, now treated him like part of the family. "You know, Mr. Richard," Mary commented as they arranged some cans, "it had been years since I'd seen Mrs. Helen so lively. She's always been kind, but since you arrived, She seems to have regained something she had lost. Richard smiled, feeling a mix of gratitude and unease. Mary, sometimes I worry that we're being a bother. A bother? Mary laughed softly. You don't realize how your presence has brought new life to this house. Even Dr. Michael is different, more relaxed. That laboratory was covered in dust before Sophia came. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Helen, who entered the kitchen with a special gleam in her eyes. Richard, dear, I need to talk to you. She led him to her office, an elegant room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Richard noticed that she looked a bit paler than usual, but her enthusiasm made up for any signs of fatigue. I've been thinking, she began, sitting in her favorite armchair, that little shop on the corner of Maple Street is for sale. It's an excellent spot for a grocery store, and I know you mentioned having experience with management. Richard felt his heart race. In recent days, he had shared fragments of his past as a businessman with Mrs. Helen, though he still hadn't mustered the courage to reveal all the details of his bankruptcy. Mrs. Helen, you're not suggesting... I am, she smiled. I want to make an investment, and I trust you to manage it. It would be a partnership, 50% each. Richard was speechless. The offer was too generous, almost unreal after everything he had been through. But why? Because I believe in you, she replied simply, and because I need something to keep me busy besides watering my orchids. She laughed, but Richard noticed a shadow quickly pass through her eyes. At that moment, Michael entered the office with Sophia, who proudly carried a test tube with a bluish solution. Grandma, look what Sophia managed to do. She perfectly understood the chemical reaction I explained. Mrs. Helen clapped, genuinely impressed, as Sophia explained the experiment with technical terms she had clearly learned from Michael. Richard watched the scene with a full heart. His daughter, who months ago had been sleeping on park benches, was now thriving in an environment of love and learning. So, Richard, Mrs. Helen pressed gently, do you accept my proposal? Sophia, even without knowing what it was about, grabbed her father's hand. Say yes, Dad. Whatever it is, Mrs. Helen always has the best ideas. Michael laughed. I can't disagree. Grandma's intuitions rarely fail. Richard looked at each face in the room, Sophia radiant with hope, Michael with his silent support, and Mrs. Helen, whose eyes conveyed a mix of wisdom and something more, something he couldn't quite decipher. I accept, he finally replied, his voice choked with emotion, and I promise you won't regret it. Great, exclaimed Mrs. Helen, standing up with renewed energy. Michael, dear, can you call Dr. Paul tomorrow? We need to prepare the partnership documents. Later that evening, Richard found Mrs. Helen in the garden admiring her orchids. She looked tired but smiled when she saw him. Thank you, he said simply. Richard, she replied, gently touching his arm, sometimes life takes everything away from us to teach us how to rebuild in a better way. You have a noble heart and deserve this chance. He noticed she discreetly leaned on a nearby chair, as if she needed support. Michael, who was passing through the garden at that moment, quickly approached his grandmother. Grandma, it's time for your tea, he said, exchanging a meaningful look with her. Shall we go inside? Richard watched as Michael gently guided Mrs. Helen into the house, a small wrinkle of concern on his forehead. There was something unspoken hanging in the air, but at that moment his gratitude and hope outweighed any unease. The small grocery store began to take shape quickly. Richard dedicated every free moment to renovating the space, transforming the old shop into a cozy and well-organized environment. Sophia helped him on weekends, suggesting ideas for the decor and insisting they needed a special section for healthy products, a clear influence from her conversations with Michael about nutrition. One Saturday morning, as they were organizing the shelves for the grand opening planned for the following week, Richard received an unexpected visitor. A tall man in an impeccable suit entered the still under-construction store. Richard Thompson, the man said, his deep voice echoing through the empty space. It's been a while. Richard froze as he recognized Albert Johnson, his former business partner. Sophia, who was arranging some cans, sensed the sudden tension in her father and instinctively moved closer. What are you doing here, Albert? Richard asked, keeping his voice controlled for his daughter's sake. I heard you're starting a new business, Albert smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I was curious, especially considering how your last venture ended. Richard felt his stomach churn with the memories that man brought back. "Sophia, dear, can you go to Mrs. Helen's house to get that list of products we forgot?" Sophia hesitated, eyeing the visitor suspiciously, but obeyed. As soon as she left, Richard stared at Albert. "I don't know how you found out about this place, but there's nothing here for you." Albert walked around the store, examining the shelves with feigned interest. "You know, Richard, you've always been so naive. First, trusting me as a partner. Now, opening a grocery store in Johnson's Supermarket's territory. My chain won't like competition, no matter how small." "Territory," Richard laughed humorlessly. "We're in Chicago, Albert, not the Wild West. And after what you did to my company, you should be ashamed to show your face in front of me." "Me? It's not my fault if you didn't know how to manage your business," Albert replied with feigned innocence. "But I'll be direct. Close this store before it opens. It'll be better for everyone." At that moment, Michael entered the grocery store, followed by Sophia. His usually gentle face wore a serious expression. "Any trouble here?" he asked, standing beside Richard. Albert looked at Michael, assessing the situation. No trouble. Just a friendly visit from an old acquaintance." Turning to Richard, he added, "Think about what I said." After Albert left, Sophia hugged her father. "Dad, who was that man? Why were you so angry?" Richard exchanged a glance with Michael before responding. "Someone from the past, dear. Don't worry." Later, in the mansion's library, Richard told Michael and Mrs. Helen Anderson about Albert's visit. He explained how his former partner had manipulated documents and embezzled money from the company, leading it to bankruptcy. The evidence had mysteriously disappeared before he could take legal action. "Is that why you ended up in that situation?" Mrs. Helen asked delicately. Richard nodded. "I lost everything, including our home. I tried to start over, but Albert had tarnished my reputation in the market. No one wanted to hire me or do business with me." Michael, who had been listening intently, interjected, "We need to take legal action. I have a lawyer friend who can help us investigate this case." "Michael is right," agreed Mrs. Helen, though her voice sounded more tired than usual. "And we won't back down with the grocery store. If that man thinks he can intimidate us, he's very mistaken." Richard looked at Mrs. Helen with concern. She seemed paler than usual, and her hands trembled slightly as she held her teacup. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked. "Just a little tired," she smiled, but Michael quickly stood up. "Grandma, I think you should rest a bit. It's already late." As Michael helped his grandmother up the stairs, Richard remained in the library, lost in thought. The confrontation with Albert had brought up painful memories, but it also ignited a new determination in his chest. He wouldn't let his past destroy the chance for a fresh start that Mrs. Helen had so generously offered him. Sophia entered the library, carrying one of the science books Michael had lent her. She sat down beside her father and, with wisdom beyond her years, said, "Dad, we've already been through so much. That bad man won't be able to hurt us again, will he?" Richard hugged his daughter, impressed by her perception. "No, my love. Now we have a family that protects us. And this time we're going to do everything differently." From the hallway, Michael watched the scene, his face a mask of worry, not just because of Albert's threat, but because of the secret he was keeping about his grandmother's health, a secret he knew he couldn't hide much longer. The grocery store's opening was a bigger success than Richard could have imagined. Mrs. Helen had invited her friends from the neighborhood, and the small space was packed with curious and excited people. Sophia, wearing a personalized apron Michael had given her as a gift, proudly showed customers the healthy products section she had helped organize. However, the joy of the opening was interrupted when Richard noticed a group of men photographing the grocery store from across the street. He recognized one of them as an employee of Johnson's Supermarkets, but decided not to say anything to avoid worrying Sophia or Mrs. Helen. Later that night after closing, Richard stayed in the store organizing the inventory when he heard knocks at the door. It was Anthony, the owner of the neighboring bakery, a man in his 60s who always greeted everyone with a warm smile. "Can I come in, Richard? We need to talk," he said, his usually cheerful face marked by concern. Richard led him to the small office at the back of the store. Anthony sat down, visibly uncomfortable. "Son, I came to warn you. Albert Johnson is not a man to be trifled with. Over the past 5 years, he's bought out or shut down every small business in the area, The ones that resisted, well, they had problems. Richard felt a chill. What kind of problems? Mysterious inspections, spoiled goods, suppliers suddenly refusing to deliver. My bakery only survived because I've had loyal customers for decades, but I've seen many friends lose everything. As they talked, Michael arrived at the store. His face was tense, and Richard immediately realized something was wrong. "Richard, I need you at the mansion. It's about Grandma." Richard's heart tightened. Over the past few days, he had noticed Mrs. Helen becoming increasingly frail, though she tried hard to maintain her normal routine. "Go," said Anthony, standing up. "We'll continue this conversation later." At the mansion, they found Mrs. Helen in her favorite armchair in the library, paler than usual. Mary was by her side, holding her hand. "Richard, dear," Mrs. Helen smiled weakly. "Sit here. We need to talk." Michael remained standing, his restless hands betraying his anxiety. Richard realized that whatever he was about to hear, it wouldn't be good. "First," Mrs. Helen began, "I want you to know that I don't regret any decision I've made since I met you. You brought new light into this house." "Grandma," Michael tried to intervene, but she silenced him with a gentle gesture. "Let me speak, dear. Richard needs to know." Turning to Richard, she continued, "6 months ago, I found out I have a serious condition. The doctors didn't give me much time, but I refused to spend my last days in sorrow. When I met you at that gas station, I felt it was a gift from fate." Richard felt his hands tremble. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" "Because I didn't want your gratitude to be tainted by pity," she replied simply. "I wanted our time together to be natural, genuine." And it was. Michael finally sat down, his hands covering his face. "I tried to convince her to tell you earlier, but—" "Michael has been my guardian angel," Mrs. Helen smiled. "He coordinated my treatment, kept my secret, always respecting my decisions, even when he disagreed with them." Richard looked at the doctor with newfound understanding. Now he comprehended the worried glances, the cups of tea that were actually medications, the sudden departures for routine checkups. "Sophia," Richard began, thinking of his daughter who had grown so attached to the lady. "She will need all of us to help her understand," said Mrs. Helen softly. "But she is strong like you, and she has Michael, who has become more than just a teacher to her." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Sophia entered the library. She had returned from the house of a new friend from school and stopped at the door, sensing the heavy atmosphere in the room. "What happened?" she asked, her big eyes scanning each face in the room. Mrs. Helen opened her arms to her. "Come here, my dear. We have an important conversation." Mary discreetly left the library, leaving the family, because that's what they had become, to face this difficult moment together. Richard watched as Mrs. Helen, with infinite gentleness, explained her situation to Sophia, using words that a 9-year-old could understand without despairing. Sophia listened in silence, silent tears streaming down her face. When Mrs. Helen finished, the girl hugged her tightly. "But you can't leave us," Sophia sobbed. "My love," Mrs. Helen stroked her hair. "No one ever truly leaves the people they love. I will be in every flower in the garden we tended together, in every experiment you do with Michael, in every smile your father gives while serving customers at the grocery store." The days following Mrs. Helen's revelation brought a new dynamic to the mansion. Sophia began to dedicate even more time to the lady, insisting on having breakfast with her every morning before school. The two developed a ritual of caring for the orchids together, with Mrs. Helen teaching the girl the secrets of each species. Michael, while maintaining his routine at the hospital, rearranged his schedule to spend more time at home. Richard caught him several times late at night, consulting medical articles, tirelessly searching for new treatments that could help his grandmother. On one of those nights, Richard found the doctor asleep over his books in the library. "Michael," he called softly, "go get some rest." "Just one more article," murmured Michael, rubbing his tired eyes. "There's an experimental treatment in Chicago that might—" Richard placed his hand on his shoulder. "You're doing everything you can. Your grandmother knows that." Michael finally let the tears he had been holding back escape. "You know what's the hardest part? Seeing how at peace she is with all of this while It's because she was able to fulfill her last wishes," Richard replied. "Finding people to love, making a difference in someone's life. You two saved us, Michael." The next day, as Richard was organizing the grocery store, he received an unexpected visit. It was Laura, a young nurse who worked with Michael at the hospital. She often helped care for Mrs. Helen, and Richard had noticed how his son seemed different around her. "Michael told me about the issues with Albert Johnson," she said after buying a few items. "I came to let you know that he was at the hospital today, asking questions about Mrs. Helen's health." Richard felt his blood run cold. "What kind of questions?" "About how much time, well, he mentioned something about plans for the property." Laura seemed genuinely concerned. "Michael kicked him out of the hospital, but I thought you should know." At that moment, Sophia rushed into the grocery store, her eyes shining with excitement. "Dad! Dad! Mrs. Helen taught me how to propagate an orchid, and she said when it blooms, it will be all mine." Richard forced a smile, trying not to show his worry. Laura watched the interaction with tenderness. "You know," she said softly, "Michael talks about you all a lot. He said his daughter brought joy back into his and Mrs. Helen Anderson's life." Richard noticed a faint blush on the nurse's cheeks when she mentioned Michael. Before he could respond, he heard the sound of glass breaking on the sidewalk. Rushing outside, he found all the grocery store windows covered in eggs and tomatoes. Sophia, who had followed him, tightly held his hand. A group of teenagers was fleeing on bicycles, laughing. Richard recognized one of them as the son of one of the managers at Johnson's supermarkets. Laura immediately grabbed her phone. "I'll call Michael." "No," Richard interrupted. "He's already too worried about his grandmother. I can handle this." But Sophia was already cleaning the windows with paper towels. Soon, neighbors began to show up to help. Anthony brought cleaning supplies from his bakery. The lady from the flower shop came with a bucket and a new broom. Within minutes, a small, supportive crowd had formed. "See?" Laura smiled, helping with the cleanup. Good always attracts good. When Michael arrived later, he found the grocery store clean and full of customers. Many had made a point of buying extra items in solidarity. "How is Mrs. Helen Anderson?" Richard asked, noticing the fatigue on the doctor's face. "She's amazing," Michael replied, a small smile appearing on his lips. When she heard what happened, her first concern was whether Sophia had been scared. Then, she started planning an organic product fair in the grocery store parking lot for the weekend. Laura, who was still helping organize the shelves, approached with a cup of coffee for Michael. Their fingers lightly touched during the exchange, and Richard couldn't help but notice the look they shared. "We need to be prepared," Michael said after a sip of coffee. "Albert won't stop here." "I know," replied Richard, "but I also know we're not alone in this fight." Sophia, who was organizing her section of healthy products, raised her voice. "And we have to be strong for Mrs. Helen." Michael and Laura exchanged an emotional glance while Richard hugged his daughter. Outside, the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the small grocery store that had become a symbol of so much more than just a business. It was a point of resistance, unity, and hope. A week after the incident with the storefronts, the organic fair envisioned by Mrs. Helen transformed the grocery store's parking lot into a festival of colors and aromas. Small local producers set up stalls, filling the space with fresh fruits, organic vegetables, and handmade goods. Sophia, wearing her personalized apron, helped the exhibitors organize their products, enchanting everyone with her knowledge of healthy eating. Michael and Laura walked hand in hand among the stalls, publicly displaying the relationship that was beginning to blossom. Mrs. Helen watched them from her special chair, strategically placed under a tent, her eyes shining with satisfaction despite the evident fatigue on her face. "I knew they'd end up together," she commented to Richard, who adjusted a cushion behind her back. "Laura has a heart as big as her intelligence, exactly what Michael needs." Richard smiled, but his expression changed when he saw a black car pull up across the street. Albert Johnson stepped out of the vehicle, accompanied by two men in suits. "Sophia?" Richard called quickly. "Can you stay with Mrs. Helen for a moment?" The girl nodded, already starting to tell the lady about the different varieties of organic tomatoes she had learned about that morning. Richard walked over to where Albert was standing, observing the scene with an ironic smile. "Nice little party," Albert remarked. "Starting next week, we'll begin construction on the new Johnson's supermarket. Unfortunately, your grocery store will have to go." Richard felt his blood run cold. Impossible. This property has belonged to the Anderson family for decades. "Belonged," corrected Albert, handing over a folder with documents. Mrs. Helen herself signed the sale. See for yourself. Richard examined the papers, his heart pounding harder with each passing moment. The signature looked authentic, but something was off. Mrs. Helen would never sell the land without warning. This is a forgery, he accused. Prove it, Albert challenged. Oh, and there's one more thing. He lowered his voice. I know about Mrs. Helen's condition. It would be a shame if the health department found out you're handling food while caring for someone with a serious illness. Some customers might get concerned. Richard, Michael's voice interrupted him. The doctor was approaching quickly, with Laura by his side. Any problems here? Albert smiled cordially. Dr. Michael, what a pleasure. I was just explaining to your friend about the new plans for this property. Michael quickly scanned the documents Richard was holding, his face paling. This is impossible. My grandmother would never... The signature was notarized, Albert interrupted smoothly. You have 1 week to vacate the property. As Albert walked away, the market continued bustling, oblivious to the drama unfolding. Sophia had convinced Mrs. Helen to try a special green juice she had prepared herself, while neighbors and customers happily moved between the stalls. Michael, whispered Laura, who had been silent until then, that signature. The date coincides with the day your grandmother was hospitalized for tests. She could barely hold a spoon, let alone sign documents. Michael's eyes shone with understanding. Richard, we need to talk to my lawyer friend. Now. That night, after the fair, everyone gathered in the library of the mansion. Mrs. Helen, informed about what had happened, was visibly shaken. I would never sell this place, she declared, her voice weak but firm. This land has been in the family for 3 generations. It was my late husband's dream to see this space serving the community. Sophia, sitting at Mrs. Helen's feet, held her hand. We're not going to let that bad man win, are we? No, dear, replied Michael, exchanging a meaningful look with Laura. In fact, Albert Johnson just made a serious mistake. A mistake that could help us not only save the grocery store, but also uncover what really happened to your father's company. Richard looked at his friend with curiosity. How so? Dr. Paul, my lawyer friend, specializes in forgery crimes, explained Michael. And Laura worked at the hospital during Grandma's hospitalization. We can prove that signature is fake. But we need to act fast, added Laura. We don't know how much time... She stopped abruptly, looking embarrassed at Mrs. Helen, but the lady simply smiled serenely. How much time do I have? She completed softly. Enough time to see justice done, my dear. And to see you and Michael give this budding love a real chance. Michael blushed slightly, while Laura held his hand more tightly. Richard watched the scene with a mix of concern and hope. Sophia, with her unique sensitivity, stood up and hugged Mrs. Helen. You're going to see much more than this, the girl said with conviction. You'll see the grocery store grow. You'll see me doing more experiments in the lab. Mrs. Helen hugged her back, silent tears streaming down her face. Of course, my dear, of course. The following days were marked by a race against time. While Dr. Paul prepared the legal documentation to challenge the forgery, the community mobilized in a way no one expected. Anthony, the baker, organized a petition against the construction of the supermarket. The flower shop launched a social media campaign, sharing the story of the grocery store and the organic market. Laura, using her contacts at the hospital, managed to locate medical records that proved it was impossible for Mrs. Helen to have signed any documents on the indicated date. Michael, in turn, spent his nights researching similar cases of fraud involving Johnson's supermarkets. On a particularly hectic afternoon, while Richard was organizing documents with Dr. Paul at the grocery store, Sophia came running in, her eyes shining with excitement. Dad! Dad! You need to see this. She dragged Richard to the sidewalk, where a small crowd had gathered. Local merchants, customers, and neighbors formed a human chain in front of the grocery store. Some held signs with phrases like, "The grocery stays," and "No to monopoly." It was Sophia's idea, explained Laura, who had just arrived with Michael. She convinced her schoolmates to talk to their parents about the importance of local businesses. Richard looked at his daughter, moved. When did you become so articulate? I learned from Mrs. Helen, Sophia replied simply. She always says a united community is invincible. At that moment, a news van parked near the grocery store. A young journalist, carrying a microphone, approached the group. "We heard about the story through social media," she explained. "We would like to do a story about the community mobilization," the reporter said as she interviewed local business owners. Meanwhile, Dr. Paul pulled Richard aside into a corner. "We found something," he said in a low voice. "A former employee of Johnson's Supermarkets reached out. He has documents that prove a pattern of forgeries and intimidation, and more. There's evidence linking Albert directly to the bankruptcy of his former company." Richard felt his heart race. "Can we use this? We're already preparing a formal complaint. With this evidence and public mobilization, Albert will have to back down." Michael joined them, his face tense. "We need to tell Grandma about the news, but—" He hesitated. "She's not having a good day today." Richard and Dr. Paul exchanged worried glances. Sophia, who had overheard the conversation, approached. "Can I go see Mrs. Helen? I promise not to tire her." Michael smiled softly. "Of course, little one. Your presence always does her good." At the mansion, they found Mrs. Helen in her bed, looking more fragile than ever. Still, her eyes lit up when she saw Sophia. "My dear," she smiled weakly. "Come tell me about your day." Sophia carefully sat on the edge of the bed and, instead of talking about the mobilization or the news, began to tell her about a new orchid sprouting in the garden. "You know that seedling you taught me to grow? It's coming up, and I think it will bloom a pink flower, just like you said it would." Mrs. Helen smiled, silent tears streaming down her face. "You've learned well, my dear, very well." Michael watched the scene from the doorway, with Laura by his side. She held his hand in silent support. "Michael," Mrs. Helen called softly. "Come here, dear, you and Laura." The couple approached the bed. Mrs. Helen took Laura's hand and placed it over Michael's. "Promise me you'll take care of him," she asked the nurse. "Michael has always taken care of everyone, but sometimes he forgets to take care of himself." "Grandma," Michael began, his voice choked. "And you, my dear grandson, promise me you'll be happy, that you'll let love into your life. Laura is special. Don't let the fear of losing her stop you from loving." Richard, watching the scene, felt his heart tighten. Sophia stood up and hugged him, as if sensing his emotion. "Dad," she whispered. "Mrs. Helen isn't—" "Is she?" Before Richard could answer, they heard a commotion coming from the street. From the bedroom window, they could see the crowd in front of the grocery store growing. More people were arriving with signs, and now several news crews were covering the event. "What's happening?" asked Mrs. Helen, trying to sit up a little. "You were right," Sophia replied, rushing to help her get more comfortable. "The community really is unstoppable when it comes together." A small smile appeared on Mrs. Helen's lips. "I always knew this place was special, that the people here were special." She paused, breathing with some difficulty. "Michael, I think it's time we used that new medicine you got." Michael nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared the medication. Laura helped him with professional efficiency, but her eyes were brimming with tears. "Sophia," called Mrs. Helen, "promise me you'll take care of my garden and that you'll continue your studies with Michael." "I promise," replied Sophia, her voice steady despite the tears. "And I promise I'll make you proud. You already do, my love. All of you already do." The news about the community mobilization around the grocery store went viral on social media. In the following days, journalists from all over the country called, wanting to know more about the story of the small shop that was standing up to a big businessman. With each new article, more people joined the cause. Amid all this commotion, Sophia spent every free moment by Mrs. Helen's side, who now rarely left her bed. The two developed a new ritual. Every morning, Sophia would bring one of the orchids from the garden into the room, and together they would watch the flowers bloom under the first rays of sunlight. One such morning, as Sophia described a new flower that was emerging, Mrs. Helen asked Michael to bring an old box from her closet. "Sophia, dear," she said, her voice weaker than usual, "inside here is something very special that I want to show you." With trembling hands, Mrs. Helen opened the box, revealing a leather-bound blue diary. "This was my first diary. I started writing when I was your age, and I never stopped." Sophia touched the diary with reverence. "You wrote every day?" "Almost every day," smiled Mrs. Helen. "It's full of stories, thoughts, dreams, and now I want you to have it." "But," Sophia hesitated, "aren't these your private memories?" "These are memories meant to be shared, my love, especially with someone who has a heart as beautiful as yours." At that moment, Richard rushed into the room, followed by Dr. Paul and Laura. "Mrs. Helen," he began, trying to contain his excitement, "we did it. Alberto's former employee handed over all the evidence. Documents, recordings, everything that proves the forgeries." Dr. Paul stepped forward. "And there's more. We found concrete evidence linking Albert to the bankruptcy of your company, Richard. He paid people to sabotage your business and forge documents." Mrs. Helen smiled weakly. I knew the truth would come out." Laura, who was checking the lady's vitals, exchanged a worried glance with Michael. Mrs. Helen's breathing was more labored than usual. "Perhaps we should let her rest for a bit," Laura suggested gently. "No," Mrs. Helen was firm. "I want to hear everything. I want to know how we'll use this information to bring justice." Dr. Paul explained the plan. They would file a lawsuit immediately, challenging not only the fraudulent sale of the land, but also exposing all of Albert's illegal practices. The evidence was strong enough to warrant a criminal investigation. "And there's one more thing," Richard added. "The community has organized an event for this afternoon. All the small business owners who were harmed by Albert will give their testimonies publicly. The press has already confirmed their attendance." Sophia, who had been quiet until then, hugged Mrs. Helen's diary to her chest. "Does this mean we've beaten the bad man?" "It means we did what was right," replied Mrs. Helen Anderson, her words broken by labored breathing. "And that sometimes we just need the courage to face—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Her eyes closed, and her breathing became even more irregular. "Grandma!" Michael ran to her side with Laura close behind. "We need to take her to the hospital," said Laura, already preparing what was necessary. "No," whispered Mrs. Helen, opening her eyes with effort. "I want to stay here, with my family." Sophia held her hand tightly. "But you need to see the happy ending of the story." A small smile appeared on Mrs. Helen's lips. "My dear, sometimes the happy ending isn't exactly how we imagine it. But it's still happy." Michael, with tears in his eyes, began preparing the medication to ease his grandmother's discomfort. Laura helped him with professional efficiency, though her hands also trembled slightly. Richard watched the scene, his heart torn between gratitude for everything Mrs. Helen had done for them and the pain of seeing her so fragile. Dr. Paul discreetly left the room, promising to immediately begin the legal procedures. "Sophia," called Mrs. Helen, her voice almost a whisper, "read a bit of the diary for me." The girl carefully opened the book, finding a page marked with a blue ribbon. She began to read. "Dear Diary, today I learned that life sometimes surprises us in the most unexpected ways. When we think we've lost everything, that's exactly when we find our greatest treasures. We just need to keep our hearts open to recognize them." Sophia continued reading, her young voice breathing new life into the old words as the afternoon wore on and the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the windows, wrapping everyone in a warm and comforting embrace. The sun had barely risen when the news began to spread through the neighborhood. Mrs. Helen had passed away during the night, peacefully, in her own bed, surrounded by those she loved. Sophia was asleep in an armchair beside the bed, the blue diary still on her lap when it happened. Michael, who hadn't left his grandmother's side for a second, was gently supported by Laura. Richard took care of all the necessary arrangements, determined to honor Mrs. Helen with the same dignity she had lived with. The morning was well underway when Sophia finally woke up. Her eyes immediately sought Mrs. Helen, and Richard felt his heart tighten as he saw understanding dawn on his daughter's face. "Dad," she whispered, silent tears streaming down her face. "She's with the angels now, isn't she?" Richard held her tightly. "Yes, my love. And you know what? She made sure we'd be okay before she left." Sophia clutched the diary to her chest. "Can I go see her orchids?" "I promised I'd take care of them." In the garden, father and daughter found a surprise. The seedling Sophia had planted weeks ago, under Mrs. Helen's guidance, had bloomed overnight. A delicate pink orchid, just as the lady had predicted. "It's a gift from her," Sophia said with conviction. That afternoon, as news of Mrs. Helen spread, something extraordinary happened at the grocery store. Dozens of people began arriving, bringing flowers and cards. They weren't just customers or neighbors. They were lives that had been touched by the kindness of that extraordinary lady. Dr. Paul arrived with important news. "The evidence we've gathered is irrefutable. Albert Johnson has been summoned to testify, and the police are already investigating all the allegations. What about the land? Asked Richard. It's officially yours and Sophia's, the lawyer replied. Mrs. Helen changed her will a few weeks ago. She left everything documented, anticipating that Albert would try something like this. Michael, who had approached to listen to the conversation, didn't seem surprised. Grandma always thought of everything. She wanted to ensure that her legacy of kindness would continue. Laura, who hadn't left Michael's side since dawn, added, "She left letters for each of us. She asked that we only open them when we felt ready." Sophia, who had been arranging flowers at the grocery store counter, approached with the blue diary. "I found a page she specially marked for today. May I read it?" Everyone nodded, and the girl began. "Dear diary, today I understood that the true meaning of life isn't about how much time we have, but how we use that time. Every act of kindness is a seed planted that will continue to bloom long after we're gone. Every shared smile is a light that stays lit in someone's heart." Michael hugged Laura, finally letting his tears flow freely. Richard observed how his daughter had matured over those months, how she now understood truths that many adults never reached. The grocery store bell rang, and everyone was surprised to see Albert Johnson entering. His face bore an expression no one there had seen before: regret. "I've come to offer my condolences," he said, visibly uncomfortable. "And I've come to acknowledge my mistakes. All the accusations are true. I'll turn myself in to the authorities and do whatever it takes to right the wrongs I've caused." Richard felt a complex mix of emotions, but it was Sophia who spoke. "Mrs. Helen always said it's never too late to do the right thing." Albert looked at the girl with tears in his eyes. "She was a great lady, and you are a true family." After he left, a meaningful silence hung in the air. Laura was the first to break it. "Michael, remember what your grandmother always said about turning pain into something beautiful?" He nodded, a small smile appearing on his face. She would love to see the grocery store transformed into a community center to support small businesses. "And we could use the lab to teach science classes to other kids," added Sophia, her eyes shining. Richard looked around the grocery store, at the flowers, the cards, the people who kept arriving. Each one brought a different story of how Mrs. Helen had touched their lives. "You know," he said, "I think this is what it means to leave a legacy. It's not just material possessions, but the seeds of kindness we plant." Sophia opened the diary again, finding the last entry Mrs. Helen had made. "Dear diary, today I understand that love is the only thing that grows when it is shared. And the more we share it, the more it multiplies, creating an endless web of connections and healing. Richard and Sophia taught me that family isn't just about blood, but about choice. Michael found in Laura the love I always dreamed of for him. And me? I found peace in knowing that my time here was not in vain, that every act of kindness, every shared smile, every given hug, will continue to live in the hearts of those I loved." 6 months had passed since Mrs. Helen's departure. The grocery store, now transformed into a community center with a commercial area, was thriving more than ever. Richard had implemented a support program for small business owners, offering guidance and space for them to showcase their products. The old office at the back of the store had been converted into a small library, where Sophia spent hours organizing books donated by the community. On a special shelf, protected by a glass cover, was Mrs. Helen's blue diary, open for everyone to read her words of wisdom. On a particularly busy Saturday afternoon, as Sophia helped an elderly woman choose books, Michael and Laura arrived at the grocery store hand in hand, their smiles impossible to contain. "Sophia," called Michael, "we have some news to share." The girl ran to them, already guessing from the glow in the couple's eyes. "Are you getting married?" Laura laughed, showing off a delicate engagement ring. "Michael asked me last night in the orchid garden." "Mrs. Helen's favorite place," added Michael, his voice choked with emotion. Richard, who was helping some customers, came over to congratulate the couple. Sophia, however, was already in planning mode. "We can have the ceremony here at the grocery store, and use the orchids from the garden to decorate and—" "Actually," Michael gently interrupted, "we wanted to ask for your help with something special. Laura and I would like you to be our maid of honor." Sophia's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Helen would be so happy." "She is happy," Laura stated with conviction. "I'm sure she's smiling at us right now." At that moment, Dr. Paul entered the grocery store, carrying a folder of documents. His face was lit up with a satisfied smile. "Richard, I have great news. The judge just ruled that all your assets, which were irregularly taken by Albert, will be returned. And there's more. All the small business owners who were harmed will be compensated." The news spread quickly through the store. Customers and neighbors gathered to congratulate Richard, turning the moment into a small, impromptu celebration. "Dad," Sophia called out amidst the commotion, "can we use some of the money to expand the scholarship program?" Richard looked curiously at his daughter. "What scholarship program?" Sophia blushed slightly. "It's a project Michael and I have been planning to help kids who love science but can't afford extra classes. I thought we could use the lab." Michael smiled proudly. "Sophia has already put together a whole schedule of classes and experiments. She has a natural talent for teaching." "Just like Mrs. Helen," Laura commented, hugging the girl. Richard felt his heart swell with pride and gratitude. His daughter, who just over a year ago had been sleeping on park benches, had now become a determined young woman, eager to make a difference in the lives of others. "You know," he said, "I think we can do even better. What do you think about turning the entire attic into a community educational center?" Sophia's eyes sparkled. "Can we call it the Helen Anderson Educational Center?" "It's perfect," Michael replied, discreetly wiping away a tear. Laura, who was watching the activity in the store, remarked, "It's amazing how a simple act of kindness can create so many transformations." "It wasn't a simple act," Sophia corrected, picking up Mrs. Helen's diary. "It was love. Look at what she wrote here." The girl opened the diary to a marked page and read, "Dear Diary, today I understood that every person we cross paths with is an opportunity to do good. We don't need grand gestures or material wealth. Sometimes all someone needs is a chance, a kind look, or an outstretched hand. And when we offer that, the universe conspires to multiply that kindness in ways we could never imagine." Richard hugged his daughter, observing the grocery store full of life and purpose. Mrs. Helen's words rang true in every corner of that space, in every shared smile, in every small act of kindness that multiplied day after day. The day of Michael and Laura's wedding dawned with a gentle spring breeze. The grocery store had been transformed into a dreamlike setting with orchids everywhere, some of them grown from the seedlings Sophia had nurtured so lovingly over the past year. Sophia, dressed in a delicate blue dress, Mrs. Helen's favorite color, was helping to organize the final touches of the decorations. Her skilled hands arranged the floral displays with the same care she had learned through her scientific experiments. "Everything is perfect," said Richard, watching his daughter put the finishing touches on an arrangement. "Mrs. Helen would have loved to see this." "She is seeing it," Sophia replied with conviction. "Look how much more beautiful the orchids are today." The ceremony was intimate and emotional. Michael and Laura exchanged vows under a floral arch, in the same spot where the grocery store's checkout counter once stood. The space, now transformed into a community center, had never seemed more fitting for celebrating love. During the reception, Richard noticed Sophia sitting in the reading nook, flipping through Mrs. Helen's diary. He approached quietly. "Found something special?" Sophia smiled, showing him a page. "This is the last entry she wrote, the night before she passed. Do you want to hear it?" Richard nodded, sitting down beside his daughter. "Dear Diary," Sophia began to read, "today I understood that life is an endless cycle of love. Every act of kindness we perform lives on in the people we touch, who in turn will touch other lives, in an unbroken chain. I see it in Sophia's smile when she makes a new discovery, in the loving look Michael gives Laura, in Richard's determination to help other merchants. I leave happy, knowing that my love will live on through them." Richard felt tears in his eyes. Sophia carefully closed the diary and looked at the party happening around her. "Dad, remember when we used to sleep on that park bench?" "I do, my love. Back then, I was afraid to sleep. But now I understand that sometimes we need to go through tough times to find our true path." Michael and Laura approached, beaming. Laura held a small package in her hands. "Sophia," she said, "Michael and I wanted to give you this." Inside the package was a white lab coat with the name Doctor. Sophia embroidered on the pocket. "For when you start your classes at the educational center," explained Michael, "you'll be an excellent science teacher." Sophia hugged them both, her face glowing with happiness. "I'll teach everything I've learned from you. And I'll tell Mrs. Helen's story to all the students." Richard watched the scene with a full heart. The grocery store, now a space for learning and unity, continued to grow. The scholarship program had already benefited dozens of children, and the small business owners in the area found the support they needed to thrive there. In the garden, Mrs. Helen's orchids continued to bloom, lovingly cared for by Sophia. Each flower that opened seemed to carry a message of hope and renewal. "You know," said Sophia, still hugging Michael and Laura, "I think I've understood what Mrs. Helen meant about love multiplying when it's shared. It's like the orchids. The more cuttings we make, the more flowers we have to share." Laura smiled, exchanging a meaningful look with Michael. "And soon we'll have more love to share. I'm pregnant." The news was met with hugs and tears of joy. Sophia immediately began making plans. "I'm going to be the best aunt in the world. I'll teach everything about science and orchids and about kindness," Richard added. "Just as Mrs. Helen taught us." At that moment, a gentle breeze swept through the room, causing the orchids to sway delicately. The scent of the flowers filled the air, bringing with it the comforting feeling that, somehow, Mrs. Helen was there, celebrating with them. Sophia picked up the blue journal and held it close to her chest. "Love never ends, does it? It just transforms." "Exactly," Michael replied, looking affectionately at his wife. "And now it's our turn to continue this story." Richard looked at his family, no longer just him and Sophia, but everyone gathered there, united by the love and kindness of an extraordinary lady who once believed in the power of a simple act of kindness. In the sky, the first stars began to shine, like tiny points of light guiding the way to new dreams and possibilities. Their story, just like the love that started it, would continue to grow and multiply, touching more and more lives in an endless cycle of hope and renewal.